What's going on? It's SFT, and I have a really interesting video and some interesting topics to talk about today, and it's going to be based on college football. I'm a big college football fan, and man, we've had a great overall college football season. A lot of great matchups, whether it be Oregon versus Ohio State, Texas versus Georgia, Georgia versus Alabama, Georgia versus Ole Miss last week, and coming into this week, Georgia versus Tennessee. Obviously, we have Indiana versus Ohio State coming up later on in the schedule, but we've had a lot of quality football games. And as the season comes through, the college football rankings and the playoffs are going to start panning out, and we're going to see how they look. And today's conversation will be based on the playoffs and the concept of losses, and not just that, right? The overall impact this season will have on next season's schedule making, because as you can see in the rankings as of late, Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, Indiana are four of the top 5 teams. And these teams, in my opinion, have had, not the same schedules as tougher teams like Alabama or Georgia has had. And that brings in the conversation about toughness of schedule, and a lot of people complaining that there's a lot of SEC bias. But in reality, the SEC games are so much more difficult. We're going to start off with that. SEC games this season have been so much more difficult than out to any other conference. You have teams like South Carolina, Vanderbilt coming through and bringing in huge upsets to Alabama, to teams like Texas A&M. South Carolina absolutely rolled Texas A&M. They put the beats on my Oklahoma team too, but they took care of business against multiple different teams. They've been really showing the quality they have, especially this week against Vanderbilt. And you look at a team like Missouri losing to Texas A&M, getting kind of rolled by Texas A&M. There's a lot of tough matchups teams in the SEC has to go through. If we were to go through some of the top teams in the SEC that have a tough strength of schedule, we look at Georgia this year, man. You have to play against Tennessee. You played against Alabama and Ole Miss. You already played against Texas, right? So we're talking about 4 top 12 teams. And if you lose 3 of these games, let's say if you lose 2 of these games, you're not getting home advantage. And should you be getting home advantage? That's a conversation of itself, but you're not getting home advantage. The issue I have with this new scheduling is you're rewarding teams for really not playing against good competition. I remember a couple of years ago where we used to have teams like Clemson roll through the ACC, put in average performances, but either way, guess what? They would still come through because they're 12-0. I remember when we used to watch my Oklahoma team at least take care of business in the Big 12, but at the same time, there wasn't no real competition. Now there is in the SEC, right? So we used to have playoffs where teams had relatively easy schedules. As long as they took care of business against teams that were significantly better than, they should get an opportunity at the college football 4-team playoff. Now, you look at it, Alabama has played LSU, they played Georgia, obviously they lost to Vanderbilt, but they lost to Tennessee. Alabama has had a serious strength of schedule. You look at a team like Texas A&M. Texas A&M has played against LSU. They beat LSU too, quite quality win. They lost to South Carolina, a really tough loss. They lost to Notre Dame, right? They beat Missouri, a number 9 ranked Missouri at the time. They've had some quality wins and some really tough losses. So as we have a conversation about the college playoffs, we have to remember that teams, if you're a team that has a really tough strength of schedule and you're a good football team and you lose close football games, let's just say you were to lose 3 football games, should you still be allowed in the college football playoff? Somebody may say, oh, a team like Miami, for example, if they go the rest of the season taking care of business and win the ACC, deserves to get an over you. Or a team like Notre Dame that lost to Northern Illinois, but after Northern Illinois, and obviously they beat at the start of the season Texas A&M, they've beaten up on easier teams. I think this week they have Army coming up, but they haven't really beaten any quality football teams. BYU has not beaten any quality football teams. Another team in BYU hasn't been a top 10 team. Indiana hasn't been a top 10 team. Penn State has not been a top 10 team. We've been calling Penn State frauds for years because they always come up short against elite competition. They never step up, especially offensively. Their defense is serious. It's just that their offense is so damn poor. Could have scored a touchdown against Ohio State. There's so many teams in the top 10 who haven't versed the same competition as teams like Georgia, teams like Alabama. I'd even say teams like Ole Miss. Some of these Tennessee, same thing. Some of these SEC teams, they've really been put through the ringer. And if you look at a team like Texas, man, Texas, other than Georgia, who the hell else did they face? And a really disappointing at-home loss to Georgia. Who the hell else did they face? They had a tough one against Vanderbilt. Outside of that, they beat up on Florida, I guess, if that matters at all, which doesn't matter to me at least. It's important to win against the teams that you should be winning against. Alabama has no business losing to Vanderbilt, However, we can't reward football teams that play against no hard competition, play against no top 10 team, and then say, you know what? You're a top 5 ranked team just based off your schedule. Come on now. That ain't right. You know, a team like Indiana being ranked 5th. Yes, they took care of business against a Nebraska team that is shown the last couple of weeks is weak. Yes, they took care of business against a team like Michigan, which has an inept offense. But we're going to see how they look against Ohio State. But the fact that Indiana is only playing against Ohio State in terms of competition for the season, come on, man. The Big Ten has been a huge disappointment, especially with the schedule making. And I want to see a difference hopefully next year. In totality, we cannot be punishing teams for going up against tough competition, especially when it comes to the SEC. And imagine how next year's going to look. We were so excited for conferences to open up because we want to see tough teams, quality football teams, whether it be Texas going to Michigan. At the time, in my mind, I thought it was going to be a good game, you know, on schedule. It didn't end up being one. Or Ohio going to Oregon, right? We want to see these tough football games, these quality football games, rather than watching Oregon versus, I don't know, Washington State, you know, some of these Pac-12 teams that they're just going to run over and then lose last year twice to Washington. I don't want to watch games like that. I don't want to watch you lose to the only competition you have throughout the season. No. I want a team to have multiple opportunities to stay in the playoff, and I want them to always be playing against quality competition. I was so happy for the conferences to open up because we were going to get the best quality games, man. I thought we all agreed that we wanted the best quality games. We wanted to be excited for teams like Penn State to be playing against teams like USC at the time, at least, you know, thought of it. We were excited to see potentially teams like Alabama play against teams like Georgia more consistently, but however, if we reward teams that do not have a tough schedule by simply giving them a top 4 spot, a perfect example is Penn State. If we reward teams like Penn State over teams like Alabama, over teams, I would even say like Ole Miss, the fact that we're rewarding them a 4th place spot, you know, same thing with Texas. Texas' schedule isn't tough enough. We can't be rewarding these football teams that do not play against tough competition. Because imagine next year Georgia says, you know what, we're not playing against Alabama, we're not playing against Texas, or we might play against Texas based on this year's result. We're not playing against Tennessee, we're not playing against Ole Miss. Give us a bunch of scrubs, you know, give us the bottom feeders of the SEC. We'll play against Florida. We love playing against Florida. They're an easy win. We're going to play against Mississippi State, and we're going to keep stacking up these wins. The rest of them are going to be out of conference wins. Georgia Tech, they should be beating Georgia Tech. And we're going to have an easier schedule, just like a team such as Penn State. What the hell is the point of opening up the conferences if we're not going to be looking at these tough games favorably? It's really not right for us to punish these teams that have these tough schedules, that play against these really good football teams and somehow come up short. I don't think that's right. People call it SEC bias. I don't think that's right too, calling it SEC bias. I think you should look at it and say, these teams are not playing against easy teams. They're not Boise State running through competition, no. They're playing against tough football teams. Now, am I saying that teams like Notre Dame that had USC scheduled up later on in the season or played against Florida State should be punished for it? No, I'm not. They assumed that these football teams would be respectable football teams. Teams should not be punished for the fact that teams like Michigan fell off, you know, teams like that fell off. Teams that are supposed to be having 10 wins or more fell off, no. But teams like Georgia or Ole Miss should be given that little nod of, okay, you played against some serious competition this year. You've had some like really disappointing games. However, you've had some really good quality wins. There's not a lot of teams that I can look at and say they've had better. If I look at a team like Oregon, has Oregon won better games than Alabama? No, they haven't. Alabama's beat Georgia. Alabama's beat LSU. They had a really tough, obviously they had a poor loss to Vanderbilt, and they had a disappointing loss to Tennessee. But the quality of the wins, should the quality of the wins outweigh the losses? That's a question for the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. Subscribe and peace.